Welcome to Stories of Brisco and Bradshaw. I would be Bradshaw, and that would be your Chickasha native, your Chickasha Hall of Famer, Oklahoma's favorite son, Mr. Gerald Brisco. And we have got a treat today. He's back. Terrific book here, Six Pack by Brad Balukjian. Brad has written a terrific book, and he's got incredible stories about a certain Vince McMahon, about the Cape Cod era, about growing up era. We wanted to talk to him more about it, so we asked him to come back on. He said, "Let me do a little more research." He's done it. He's the expert. Me and Mr. Brisco can't wait to hear it. Brad, welcome to the show.
Hey, glad to be back, guys. Happy to encore here.
It's been
Well,
fantastic. I picked the book up, today and just started rereading it because I'd already read it once. But man, the stuff with early Vince McMahon, it's just fascinating. It's just a lot of things happened. As happens with anybody. If he doesn't meet his father when he's at a very young age, we you wouldn't have written this book, and we probably wouldn't have ever heard of Vince McMahon Jr. because there wasn't
yeah,
one. He created it, right?
yeah, I mean, it's I maintain that the documentary that came out a couple months ago, the McMahon documentary, I'm sure you guys watched it, right?
Hmm.
The Netflix thing. I thought, I mean it was well done for an audience that doesn't know wrestling that well or doesn't know Vince very well, but it kind of hit a lot of the same notes that have been hit over again. And I think most hardcore wrestling fans didn't learn a whole lot of new stuff there. I would love to see someone do a Vince McMahon documentary where they really try to just break new ground, right? And the most new ground to be broken is in this era, this period that you wanted to bring me back to talk about. And I admit, like, there's a lot. I only know the tip of the iceberg. I hope there are writers and documentarians out there that are interested in covering that period from basically when Vince graduates from East Carolina University at age 23 in 1969, all the way up to when he buys the company from his dad in June of 1982. Like the 70s is kind of the missing piece in the Vince story. Like we know little bits and pieces here and there, but there's still a lot more that can be figured out. So I'm happy to share what I know. And, some of this stuff has been brought to light by other writers that have done really great stuff. Tim Hornbaker, Josie Reisman, written books about these topics. So people should check out their material as well. But yeah, where do you want to start in terms of
Well,
getting into that?
one thing wanted to talk about was the Cape Cod years, which was so interesting because that was kind of I thought his formative years, and I think you did as well as Mr. Briscoe of his first learning the art of promotion when he's by himself, and it's kind of not been written, not been talked about a lot. But before that, you were talking about some of the formative years of the '70s when he did some commentary for his dad during that time and was
Yeah.
working with his dad. Tell us just a little bit about that before we get to those Cape Cod years, because that part is this upbringing events. He's such a unique character. I mean, there's nothing
Yeah.
like him. You don't become a billionaire from zero when having outdoor toilets when you're growing up to being a billionaire without something in your life happening that to form this in your mind that makes you want to do this.
Yeah, and I think, maybe forget that. So Vince, by the time WrestleMania 1 comes around, Vince is almost 40. So, he's not necessarily a young man, right? I mean, he's sort of middle-aged. And when the company really starts exploding, that's now 40 years ago. So to your point, like there was a lot of trial and error in Vince's early life. It wasn't like this is a guy that everything he touched turned to gold. He had a lot of struggles. He had a lot of ups and downs. I think what is obvious if you really study his life is that both he and Linda incredibly savvy politically. Not surprising now that what Linda's in line to be the Department of Education head, right, for the Trump administration. And we know that Vince has gone on to all kinds of huge success. So I think like even those early years, you see the building blocks of that political acumen. So in the 70s, Vince, 1970, he is when Shane is born, and they live Shane and or Vince and Linda lived in a town called Gaithersburg, Maryland, which is just outside of Washington, D.C., where his dad, Vince Sr., had his offices for Capital Wrestling. And in the early 70s, sort of right out of college, I think Vince and Linda were just trying to figure out what they were going to do. It wasn't like his dad was like, "Oh yeah, like we're going to make you the successor of the wrestling company." So in those early 70s, Vince and some investors, they went in and they invested in a horse ranch and then a cement plant. These are things people probably had no idea about, and they flopped. Those early investments didn't work. So then Vince in 1972, he's at a TV taping, and his dad, there's the commentator for the TV. I don't know if this was at Madison Square Garden or just their regular TV taping, but Ray Morgan was the commentator, and he tried to get a raise out of Vince Sr. And basically Vince Sr. was like, "No, you're fired," and then just turned to Vince Jr. and said, "Okay, you're my new commentator." And
Good
Wow.
that's
piece,
how
a good piece of trivia there. Ray
Yeah,
Morgan is the
really.
one that
Yeah.
got fired and got Vince the job. Tremendous.
that's how Vince, I mean, so all those years later with Vince as a little side, I'm curious what you guys think. Like, I actually kind of miss the Vince commentary.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Like
he was good.
I liked Vince on play by play.
Vince, people love to bash Vince because that's the smart
Yeah.
thing to do. It's like, oh, he was terrible. Wasn't Gordon Soley. He wasn't this, that, and Vince was good. He actually was really good. Plus, he would do it by himself a lot of times.
Yeah, and I think he got a lot better when he was like in the 80s when he would have like Jesse Ventura
Yeah.
or he would have Gorilla. I mean, what did you think, Jerry, of him as a
Well,
commentator?
I think you're exactly right. When it first started, I mean, there was a lot of backstage talk. Vince can't pull this off. You never say Kate in front of Vince McMahon's name, because he's going to pull it off to spite of you. But I agree. He finally found his niche at doing that when Jesse the Body was a perfect foil for him. Ventura, would play off of Vince and would feed Vince lines at like crazy because Jesse was just that sharp of a commentator. So, but in the early days, he was struggling, and he knew he was struggling. Is the thing about it, and he didn't ever pretend like he thought he was a great commentator because he wasn't, and he kind of and he needed help, just like a lot of us. JBL needed Michael Cole, outside of him to become a great commentator, and he did because of it. Other guys are the same way, but yeah, that era when Vince was doing the commentating, what was it, entertaining era, and he added that intensity I think that was missing instead of that old monotone just Gordon Soley type blah blah blah. Vince would get in your face with his commentary, and that would perk people up. And when somebody's hollering at you from the TV screen, you're going to look up and say, "What's going on here?" So I think that's what he added.
And the other thing, Jerry, you mentioned Vince, man, people talk about his ego, but you can't have an ego as a play-by-play commentator because you got, especially when you got a guy like Jesse Ventura, because you have to be the butt of the joke. And if
Right.
your ego is so big that you don't allow yourself to be the butt of the joke, you ruin the show. I've worked with a ton of commentators, ton of play-by-play guys, and the guys with the egos, the guys you don't want to be out there with. Michael Cole doesn't have an ego except in the product.
Yeah. Yeah.
He always has a big ego like everybody else does that makes it on television, but your ego has to be in the product. And Vince's ego was in the product in the right place. And that's another reason that it worked so well with Jesse because Vince didn't mind being the butt of the joke. And a play by play guy that minds that is never going to get along with a guy like Jesse Ventura or Bobby Heenan or Jerry Lawler or anybody. But you're going to have to allow yourself to be the butt of the joke. And Vince did that and did it very well.
Yeah, I think if you listen to those old Saturday night's main events, from the mid late 80s with Jesse and Vince, you can kind of tell like there's this underlying animosity between those two guys. Like they didn't like each other, but what was, to your point, John, Vince was a professional. So yeah, he was going to, play the role and let Jesse play his role, but I think what Jesse Ventura probably loved is that he got to nail Vince. He got to go after him and Vince because on air he couldn't do any, Vince is the boss. But in that sort of kayfabe environment of commentary, Jesse got to go at him toe to toe. And what made Jesse so great is that even though he was a heel, he would he would he had this sense of fairness. So if there was any kind of a double standard, if the babyface did something illegal, he would point it out and make Vince or the babyface commentator acknowledge or not
Right.
acknowledge that they were being biased, right? So he had this incredible gift to be able to call out Vince, and Vince couldn't do anything about it.
And he did that recently on Saturday Night's Main Event. It was so
Yeah,
freaking
yeah,
Jesse. And I love Jesse. He's got banter that people don't understand unless you've been
yeah,
on there with him. That guy's different level. But Michael Cole said something about, well, he cheated. And he goes, who used the chair, Cole? Who used the chair?
Right,
And
right,
it's like,
exactly,
dude, you're the freaking best. And that's
exactly.
why we love
and
him.
too on Jesse's part, when Jesse would get backstage after a show, the guys would be patting him on the back because he was nailing Vince, to which is something everybody in the back wanted to do, but Jesse had that an open microphone, and there was nothing they could do about it. But yeah, Jesse through the ego enjoyed his job so much that it came through like that.
I remember one time Jesse was out there with Vince. They had a picture of like some young girls in the front row, and Jesse goes, "Look at those rats, McMahon! Look at those rats!" And Vince was like, I don't know how to answer that. It was just Jesse being crazy, just trying to get him to do anything, just which was one of you talk about the boys loving Jesse's commentary. That's one of the reasons people love the boys loved it because he would say anything. He was so freaking nuts and so smart. So
Back, back,
what was the relationship between Vince McMahon Senior and Vince McMahon Jr. And did Vince McMahon Senior did he take it as an honor that Vince had changed his name to Vince McMahon Jr.? Was there any pushback on that? Do you know?
I don't know. I mean, all of this to some extent is sort of armchair psychology because I wasn't there, but I think from what I've been told that I think Vince Sr. early on, I think it always hurt Vince Jr. that Vince Sr. did not acknowledge that he had a son or two sons for the first part of Vince's life, right? That he was not in his life at all. And no one knows exactly how Vince Sr. came to meet Vince Jr. and to like when he was in his teenage years, but it seems like it might have been Vince Sr.'s wife, so not Vince's mom, because Vince was raised
Juanita, right?
Juanita, yeah, because Vince was raised by his mom and his stepdad,
Right.
who was abusive. But it seems like Juanita may have kind of pushed Vince Sr., hey, these are your sons, you've got to meet them. And then when Vince is in his teenage years and he meets his dad, as he said, he fell in love with his dad. He loved everything about the wrestling business. I think his dad probably knew what a dirty business wrestling was, and so didn't want Vince necessarily to go into it, but he could also see that this is what Vince loved. And so at some point yielded to, okay, this is what you want, this is what you're going to get,
Gotta
but
get it.
made it hard for him, right? So he didn't put him in some plum job. He put him out there with no training on his own as a play-by-play commentator, and then told him if you want to promote, you got to go to Bangor, Maine, and the first towns that you're going to promote are the furthest, most northernmost part of my territory.
Yeah.
And Vince and Linda at this point, they had moved from Gaithersburg, Maryland to I believe it's West Hartford, Connecticut in the 70s. And so Vince had to make those drives all the way to Bangor, Maine, just to set up the shows and manage the shows, on the road a lot doing that. So I think that, again, from what can understand, I don't think Vince Sr. was ever an emotionally demonstrative guy. He wasn't someone that told Vince Jr. that he loved him, until the very end of his life. I think a lot of Vince's psychology and, issues have to do with not having had enough love from his dad growing up and being supported in an emotional way. I think his dad supported him, in his work and financially, but
Yeah,
I think there's
Brad,
all,
I don't know what years this chimed in, but I know in the mid-70s when Florida Championship Wrestling, we would run like a big show in Hollywood, Florida, when the Hollywood Sportatorium first opened up. Of course, we were Eddie Graham and Vince Senior always had a great relationship because Eddie had worked for him and really become a star and made his money to buy the territory from Vince. when he came down there. They kept that relationship, but we when we do those big shows, we'd always do them in the wintertime where the snowbirds would be in Florida. And of course, Vince was always had a car sent to him. He would always bring Vince Jr. around, and Vince Jr. would just kind of hang in the shadows of his dad. He wasn't
Really?
really,
What
yeah,
year
he he
in the
wasn't an
70s?
outgoing type guy at that time. I mean, he was just kind. You'd walk up to him, and we're basically the same age, and I always tried to befriend him and those. And he just kind of seemed standoffish all those times, and same with my brother, and a lot of other guys, even our stars like Dusty and everything, would what's wrong with that guy? Why isn't he more friendly and everything? But Vince Senior was the outgoing one, and Vince Senior was really took the ball at that time. So
So Jerry, this was in the 70s, and so Vince Senior was bringing him on down into his South Florida house,
yeah.
and would bring him to the shows there with you guys.
When we were on big shows with Superstar Billy Graham and some of the other WWF superstars that Vince had, because we knew all the snowbirds were in town, so we booked those guys on our big shows down there, and they'd help us draw the big houses that we
Yeah.
did.
Brad, did Vince Jr., which I know he hates being called Junior, so I just it always just scares me when I say it because I'm scared he's gonna listen to this. So, but hey, if you don't know, who you calling Junior? So, did Vince Jr. know his dad?
What's JBL doing calling me Junior on your podcast?
Yeah, exactly. Did Vince McMahon, as we know him, the son of Senior, did he know his dad was a famous promoter before he met him? I mean, his dad is a world famous promoter. He's the promoter of Madison Square Garden, the most famous arena in the world. He comes from a legendary family of promoters. Did he know this?
I think he knew vaguely. I don't know exactly. I think he was aware of it. But I don't think he knew, I don't think he was watching, wrestling or, up to speed on what was going on in that world. But I think he did know that his dad was a promoter and successful and all of that.
It's such a cool story. The New York Lincoln Giants his grandfather had. I mean, it's just the McMahons in Madison Square
Yeah,
Garden.
it's a promotional dynasty, that goes back over 100 years now, and I mean,
Wow.
it continues with Paul Levesque, and I mean, it's
Right.
still, it's still there. So I think, but back to Jerry's point about, in the 70s, I think Vince as a commentator in the 70s was really trying to pattern himself after Howard Cosell, and he was not very good, but he was always very ambitious. And I will say, I'm a writer, and I learned some of my early vocabulary from Vince and Gorilla Monsoon because these guys they commentated with the degree of their diction, their vocabulary was really good. Like for a guy that had a 2.0 GPA in college and from all accounts was a terrible student, Vince actually had a pretty good vocabulary, and he would present that to the audience and with that voice in this very authoritative way. And so even though he was rough early on, like he got to be really good, as we're talking about. But at the same time, I don't think, Vince was never, I don't think Vince ever, like his dream was never to perfect commentating. I think he probably liked commentating because it gave him a control. He was out there right there next to the ring in front of the boys, influencing the audience at home with what he would say to get storylines over. And we all know Vince loves control. So, being a commentator was a great way to exercise that. But I think he also, his real dream was the promotional side. And so in the 70s, the big innovation in promotion was closed circuit. And Vince Sr. was friends with Bob Arum from the boxing world. And it was all about how can we put together giant spectacle events to have on closed circuit. It's funny because the medium changes. Now it's all about, Netflix, Mike Tyson and Logan Paul. Well, the equivalent of that 50 years ago was, Antonio Inoki versus Muhammad Ali. And instead of Netflix, it was this worldwide closed circuit event. Or the Evil Knievel Snake River Canyon jump, right?
How did
So
he get into that?
yeah, I don't know how he met Evil Knievel, but he met him and he was taken by this character. I mean, that's Vince, right? Is
That's right
he
there.
gets taken by a larger than life character. He has these projects that he just thinks, oh, that's the
He
greatest.
told us one time, he said, well, he said he could make it. And that was the whole rationale for promoting it. Like, Vince, this is Wile E. Coyote stuff. You don't tie yourself to a rocket and hope you land somewhere over
Yeah.
there. There was no plan. It was the dumbest thing I've ever seen.
And
Knievel
it
is so lucky to be alive.
and it failed spectacular. I mean,
Which
Horribly.
no,
did that come first, or did the Ali fight come first?
the Evil Knievel was September of 74, and the Ali fight was June of 76.
Okay.
Yeah, because
And
Vince, when asked about it, he jokingly will always say, when people ask how much of a success it was, he says, always say it was an artistic success. So whenever Michael Cole and I were out there, we'd see some match that was bad. We'd say, that is an artistic success. And Vince would get in our ear and go, you're both fired. You're both fired. He thought it was hilarious. You know, one thing else about Vince's commentary, I will go back. I want to get back to Muhammad Ali, not Muhammad Evil Knievel, just a minute, but Vince was big on diction. He hated the word very. He hated it. If he says, "Boy, he's very tough," Vince go learn English. You know, he didn't want you to say very tough. He's masculine. Whatever it is. Very just means you don't know words, and
right.
Vince hated that. It was really. I
Well,
learned a lot doing commentary from him.
that's a really good point for, I mean, as a writer, the word very is way overused
Right.
to like it to yeah, it's he has a really good point. It doesn't add a lot to say that.
So how did Vince have the money to promote Evil Knievel? That has to be that's the most non sequitur I've ever heard
Well,
of.
well, before I get, so I want to ask you, John, like when you were was Vince always in your ear the whole show?
No, yes and no, yes and no. But he was very succinct. He was not a guy who dictated. He wasn't a guy like people see Vince as this puppet master backstage, which he can be, but he was not with us. He would not. You don't just he wouldn't just say what to say. He
Mhm.
would give you very short little sentence because of where he wanted you to go. And he
Yeah.
was a very, very good producer. He was the best producer I've ever worked with. I
Is it
think
true?
he did commentary so much.
Is it true that he hated calling it pro wrestling?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
100%. And no matter what, you took pro wrestling out, it was always sports entertainment.
Do you think,
100%.
like, what do you think? Do you think that he really, I mean, I understand from a marketing perspective, but like, I mean, it's a family and from wrestling. Like, did he really not like that association?
It was the association, from what I understand, because I did so much commentary with him. Everything was an upgrade. So he wanted to get out of the VFW halls. He wanted to get out of the high school gyms. He wanted to create something different that was going to have Liberace and Muhammad Ali at it. And that was his own genre that he created of sports entertainment. Now I think it's completely different because now pro wrestling has a huge different connotation. Now you
Yeah.
see stars in it and stars love it. And you see these arenas being sold out. People call it all pro wrestling. It's different from what it was, as Jerry will say, back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when Vince was coming up and there was so much negative connotation to it. Vince wanted nothing with that negative connotation. That's why he chose to go public twice. So we went on the NASDAQ first because I was there and I did the road shows with him. The NASDAQ first so he could do the NYSE second.
Mhm.
That was a plan all along. He wanted the two things, but that was to take them out of the VFW halls, is what that was.
Got it. Got it.
Even Brad back in the old days. I mean, Vince for some reason. I mean, you would be in a production meeting, and being a old pro wrestler, I would say pro wrestling. It's not pro wrestling. Get over that. We're not in the South anymore. I mean, he always tied, and
Oh,
I
he
don't know
hated the South wrestling.
I don't know what the hate was over the Southern wrestling because it was so big. And he always hated that. We're not in the South. That's not pro wrestling. We're sports entertainment. And I mean, even in production, it'd have to be on air, even in private. We're not pro wrestling. Get over that. We're not pro wrestling. That was always his gig.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
famously, he told Ted Turner when Ted Turner called him, he goes, Vince, I'm in the wrestling business.
Yeah.
And yeah, well, I'm in the entertainment business.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's how Vince saw it. He saw himself, as you wrote in your book, as Walt Disney. He didn't see himself, as a modern day
Right.
Toots Mondt.
Right.
He saw
From the
himself.
from the very first time I was ever in a meeting with him, I asked him, when I made the jump, I asked him what's your vision. He said, "I want to be like Walt Disney. This is 1986. I want to be like Walt Disney. I want to have a variety. Wrestling's a variety show," was what he always preached to us. Always give them variety. You know, I got something. I want to be like Walt Disney.
Well, the interesting thing though is that pretty much the one thing that he was successful in was pro wrestling. I mean, everything else, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
didn't really work. I mean, I think, and even the success of like the movies and the network. I mean, I think there were a lot of other people, whether it's Shane or Stephanie or younger people that push some of those newer initiatives. I think when Vince actually stuck in the pro wrestling lane, that's when he had the most success.
By far. Yeah. And thank God his ego was not so big that he didn't pull the plug on those others. Vince really was day one thinking. And when WBF didn't work for a bunch of reasons, ICO Pro didn't work, XFL didn't work. Vince pulled the plug right away. A lot of guys would have not pulled the plug.
And what's interesting is like a lot of these things that later on became successful didn't work initially. Like, for example, I mean, I think Vince and Hulk Hogan really thought in 1989, like this could be our branch out into movies in Hollywood with no holds barred. I mean, Vince
100%.
Vince basically financed that. The production company is Shane Productions. I have a memo from all this archive of material that I got that shows like a call sheet for that movie, and it's Shane Productions, and Hulk I think was hoping to be the Rock. I mean, he wanted to do what the Rock did,
Yeah.
right? And when it flopped, both he and Vince were like, okay, well, we have to go back to what we know, which is wrestling.
Pro wrestling. Pro
uh,
wrestling.
Pro wrestling, right? And so but then of course, fast forward 10 or 20 years, and WWE Studios takes off, and they do become successful in movies. And then The Rock goes, and Batista and John Cena, and then the other thing is the international part. Like we all talk now about the brilliance of WWE as an international brand, and they're going almost as many mega shows overseas. Well, again, I get into this in the book a little bit, but in 80, 84, 85, 86, I mean, they went to the Middle East, they went to Australia, they tried to go to Africa, they tried to go to New Zealand. I mean, uh, he had Jim Troy exploring all of these international destinations way before that became like a really viable,
Right. Yeah.
thing for the company. So all these ideas were there early. They just didn't necessarily pan out until later on.
I tell you an
So
idea
so
that
in
was
that,
there.
so
I tell
so
you
in
an
that
idea that
Cape.
was there
Go
early
ahead.
that Jerry will knows very well as I do, was Vince's idea of global dominance. He thought he'd have, like, for lack of a better term, we didn't have NXT back then, but at NXT, an academy in almost every continent. So you'd have one in South America, you'd have a South American territory, you'd have one in Japan, have an Asian territory based off of Japan, or wherever you'd have it in the Asian continent. You'd have one in Europe, and Vince saw that. I heard Vince go through that in the mid '90s,
Mhm.
going through all that, right, Jerry?
I started going through it in the mid '80s. I mean, that was his goal from the very beginning to have a satellite office everywhere. And he said, if I can get one on the moon, I'll have one on the moon also. I mean, that's how ambitious the guy was during that time.
Yeah, yeah.
So back going to Cape Cod there, he starts assembling this group to for bigger and better things. Mentioned Jim Troy, Beamer, and Timmy White, Ed Cohen, who was a very good friend of mine and a very good mentor to me while I was doing the promotion. Ed Cohen was one of the masterminds there. And a guy by the name of Steve Taylor, which most of our fans will know as the photographer in WWE. Steve played such a dynamic role in setting everything up with Vince being able to contact talent. But that all happened from the Cape Cod days. Tell us a little bit about how he gets to Cape Cod and how he starts assembling all these guys.
Yeah, yeah. So to address what John asked about how he financed the Evil Knievel thing, well, I don't know exactly, but I do know that after that he filed bankruptcy in April of 1976.
I used to ask Vince, I said, "You don't got my money." He said, "Well, that wasn't enough. That was my first bankruptcy." I mean, he was proud of that too. He always had my first bankruptcy.
Right.
Tremendous.
So he files bankruptcy. Then he has the Ali fight with Inoki, doesn't go so well. So that's kind of the last, major closed circuit venture he does for a while. And then I think he kind of retreats, and this is when he goes to Cape Cod in 1979, South Yarmouth, Massachusetts. He and Linda go out there. Shane's about 9 years old, and so Stephanie's what, 4 or 5 maybe. Um, and they have their pretty modest house in South Yarmouth. They're leasing the Cape Cod Coliseum. So at this point, Vince, I think he's probably, the very earliest germ of an idea of what happens later, because he quietly creates Titan Sports in 1980, right? So he creates a separate business entity for himself and Linda, even though the owner of the WWF is still his father, and Phil Zacco and Gorilla Monsoon and that whole group. And their company name is Capital Sports. So, Vince is like this separate entity operating out of the Cape Cod Coliseum. And I think he does this because, he needs some revenue. He needs regular. He needs to understand, he and Linda, the what it's like to run a venue, right? So they have like the responsibility of year round. How are you going to keep this Cape Cod Coliseum going? Which is not easy because Cape Cod is a summer destination. So, how do you do that? How do you promote Cape Cod in the winter? And so but Vince being Vince, he brings in all these bands like, Tom Petty and the Grateful Dead. And this is when, he actually realizes, well, I need a more regular act than that. So he decides to go into hockey because he knows, okay, hockey guarantees 40 home dates a year, and I need that, regular revenue. What's interesting, we talked earlier about Vince and Linda as savvy politicians. Well, even back then, he starts pushing the envelope on, he's bringing in all these acts that are, rock and roll and so forth. And, the Cape Cod, especially in the winter, is a pretty sleepy small town place. He starts pissing off everyone in the town because he's got these rock concerts going on late, and causing, people are getting drunk, and so the town starts to try to clamp down on like alcohol
Wow.
sales at the venue. And there's newspaper articles that talk about this, that Vince galvanizes his crew to go to the local town council meeting in like 1981 to basically take a stand to push back on all this regulation. And again, this is the story of Vince and Linda too, is they hate regulation, right? You know,
Yes, yes.
There you go.
from the very beginning, don't regulate my alcohol sales at my Cape Cod Coliseum concerts, all the way down to, 6 years later, Linda going in, testifying and deregulating athletic commissions, admitting that wrestling is a work so that you don't get regulated by the athletic commissions, and on and on and on, always pushing for deregulation. That's part of the business strategy. And Vince is successful. He works and lobbies the town council to side with him, and continues on with his promotion. But then this is where hockey comes in. So he says, "Okay, I'm gonna go into hockey as the Cape Cod Buccaneers of the Atlantic Coast Hockey League." So this is like minor leagues of hockey. And Vince doesn't, I mean, I don't, you guys would know better than, I mean, Vince isn't really like a sports fan in general,
No,
right?
no.
No,
Of any type of sport.
right. That's right.
Yeah, which is kind of surprising, right?
Yeah, it's
It
totally
is. Yeah.
surprising. A
Yeah. It,
big
it really
macho
is.
man like Vince, you'd figure he'd be into sports, but he wasn't into any type of sport whatsoever.
Now he would keep up with results, just so he was in the know of stuff. But he was not a guy who would sit down and watch a 3 hour game. That would be like being waterboarded for Vince.
Yeah.
He couldn't handle that.
Yeah. So again, in hockey, definitely not any, I mean, Vince grew up in North Carolina, there's no hockey IQ
No.
there at all. And hockey is a very particular sport. I mean,
Were they drawing big houses and their hockey league or?
No, probably because Vince, again, is out of his league. He's out, this is not his area. So but he did bring in Jim Troy. This is how he gets Jim Troy and Mike Breen. Jim Troy is a legitimate, hockey badass player in the Rangers organization, but he broke his wrist or his hand. So he's kind of
How high up did Troy? Because you hear different versions of Troy. Yeah, like he was a big NHL star, but he was never an NHL player, was he?
No, I think Troy got to, I don't know if he ever played in the NHL, but he did get he got called up and I think he was like on the roster for a playoff
Okay.
game, but he never was in the NHL really, as far as I know, in terms of like playing, regularly. But, still a good talent, knew the sport. And so Vince brings him in as the player coach, kind of like the Paul Newman in the movie Slapshot.
Yeah.
That's the kind of environment we're talking about with the Cape Cod Buccaneers. And he's also the assistant general manager. And Mike Breen is a hockey player who's like a fighter. That's his role is
Yeah.
they have the enforcer.
Enforcer. Yeah.
So they last like not even one season because again, they're not drawing, the league's not drawing. Um, it's I'm sure not very good hockey. And so, Vince he gave it a shot and
Did Vince try anything there? We've had Ron Fuller on, and I got to send you a clip of one of the things about when he talked about with bringing hockey to the South, and he brought in the crazy entrances and the wrestling into it, and he had he helped orchestrate, I think, a few fights. Did Vince ever think about something like that? I mean, did he try anything? It just seems so unlike Vince to not say,
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
what, people love fighting. You guys might ought to fight in the second period around minute two, something. Did that never happen?
no, I never saw any evidence that he really pushed the envelope in that way. And I think early Vince, the Vince of this era, he certainly took giant risks in his business, but in terms of like the on-screen product, um, he took risks, but I think he didn't get up more of the nerve until a little bit later. Like, he was still playing it fairly close to the chest, in terms of not pushing too hard. So I don't think he did anything outlandish in the hockey arena.
Because
And
if
I
that had been Vince in 1995, you'd have had the Alabama Madman and the
Oh
Congolese
wow.
Monster. You'd have all
Yeah.
kinds of crazy people.
Yeah.
You would have a very fun version of hockey.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
well, because people, I mean, I think when you really look at Iggy, if you look down the line, like from what I understand, you guys would know that it took Vince. I mean, when Vince really started going out there was like the Attitude Era, right? And
Yeah.
what I was told, like he didn't want to do that initially. He saw that the WCW was doing that, and he got pushed by Paul Levesque and Shawn Michaels and those guys, like, hey, Kevin Nash, you got to change it up. So I think Vince, it seems like he had reluctance, but then when he went in, he went all in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. And then when you saw the XFL, you saw the Vince McMahon that we knew running it.
Right.
And unfortunately, a non sequitur, but the XFL, by the time the football got better, the ratings had slided. It slid. So it was tough. I hate it because if COVID hadn't hit, XFL probably would have worked under Vince the second time. But it just, he did some revolutionary things for sports. Then it just seems strange that I guess it was just a learning process. He was learning
I,
how to do the business.
I think the real transformation in Vince happens in the late 90s where, the combination of the prevailing in the federal lawsuit and then the Attitude Era
Yeah.
and then the huge money with going public. I think it was sort of Vince like, fuck you, I'm going to go do what I want to do now and kind of
Yeah.
it was Vince unleashed, right? And that's when
What,
things really went
yeah.
crazy.
When he beat the federal government in the steroid, and that's when I noticed Vince's attitude really changed. I beat the federal government. There's nobody that can compete with me. That was the entire mindset that he took on after they won that case against the federal government. You're right, Brad. That's when he really started changing his attitude.
One of the
Yeah.
first things he said to me, Brad, when I met him up in Stanford at Titan Towers, because I didn't meet him after my tryout match. You know, Mr. Briscoe's the one that hired me. Vince never saw me anything. I
Mhm.
walked in and met him for the first time, and one of the first paragraph in the first paragraph, he told me, "I beat the federal government," and
Yeah.
he raised his middle finger like that, and you could tell it's like this man is he's proud of
Yeah.
that,
Yeah. Yeah.
as he should be.
Yeah.
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 But
So, so
that really bolstered Vince, I think.
So back in yeah, so we're now back to the early 80s. You know, he again he so the hockey thing doesn't work, but he's really ready to make his move with wrestling because
Wait, this I'm sorry to cut you, Brad. Was he making any money with the hockey team not doing well, not drawing well? Were they losing money?
I had never seen their balance sheets, but I think they were not doing very well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at this time, and this is the time that he also bought the property in Greenwich, Connecticut, where high end property, or was that later?
Well, I think that's a little later because he's in 81, he's still in South Yarmouth. You know, he's promoting the Coliseum. But he's getting things together. And again, I don't know how he scraped together the money for the down payment, but he gets that 230 grand
Now
to
and he's also doing these tent shows for his father, right? I mean, John's worked all those summertime tent shows up there
Yeah.
with
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
Ventura,
yeah. Yeah,
which
yeah, yeah.
were very successful. Most of them were bought shows anyway, right, John? When you were
Yeah,
working
yeah.
for
Most
him.
of them were bought shows, and all of them were sold out. Small arenas, tent towns. They were literally temporary structures.
Yeah, I think he was doing pretty, okay. I mean, the valuation of the WWF in like 1980 was only like, I think like 10 million. So, it's not a huge, and that's for his dad, not him, his dad. But, when he filed for bankruptcy in 76, he claimed $1 million in debt, which is about $5.5 million today.
Now,
I
what
think
was that bankruptcy? Was that the Canyon jump or what?
that was in 76. Yeah.
Okay.
And then so fast forward, I think he stabilizes financially a little bit. But again, he's not in great financial shape, but he is able to scrape together the 230 grand to the first installment of buying the company from his dad, which he does in June of 82.
Now the rumors is I know the answer, but the rumors was that Vince had mafia connections,
Yeah, I have
and
no
then
idea.
they gave him the money.
No idea.
Your research didn't turn up any of that. Now don't be afraid of the mafia. We're mafia free here.
Well, I just know, Jim Troy was with him and Linda when they went to New York at the Warwick Hotel with apparently a briefcase full of cash to buy the company from his dad and his partners. And so they had that cash. Now, again, I don't know where they raised it. This is before he brings in the CFO, Bob McMullen. So don't know how he got the money, but he has the money. And then, of course, as people have reported, the deal is, if you miss a single payment on the other three
Right.
payments, it reverts back to me and his father.
Now,
Um,
what was the deal with Monsoon, Skolin, and Zacco? I mean, they were all partnered with Vince Senior too, right?
yeah,
Or
so my understanding is that, so he's buying their shares and he's also, kind of giving Monsoon his word that he'll employ him as, in the office. Um, and I think he always took care of Skoland, and I'm not really
Well,
sure which.
Skolin was offered that same guarantee. Arnold told me that personally.
Okay. Okay.
And
I didn't know that.
then I was working, of course, we're in Puerto Rico. Gino already had a piece of Puerto Rico with Carlos down there. And so
Yeah.
when we go down there, we kind of, tell them what's going on the floor, what's going on up there. They weren't too happy about this transaction. And I know Monsoon wasn't, and I know he was offered that deal. I think that kind of softened the blow. But were there any resistance that your research comes on those guys?
Um, I no, I don't know. I think you guys talked to Brian Solomon recently, right?
Mhm.
That
Right.
Yes.
I think he'll like he's writing a book about Monsoon. I think he'll probably have more about that. Because I'm sure he's researching a lot of that. So, but I don't know what exactly Zacho and those guys thought about. I don't think Monsoon was thrilled about it, but I don't know a whole lot about. beyond
Yeah,
that.
he wasn't thrilled, but then to go back, Zacco was one of those old school guys. I mean, he was from Jess's day, Jess McMahon's days, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Brad,
he was
I'm
there
sorry.
for a long time. I think Philadelphia, I think he promoted Philadelphia a lot, Baltimore. Yeah.
Brad, just to go back a little bit to Cape Cod for just a second, because it seems like almost was it a failed venture? Was it a good venture? Was Vince doing anything else other than just running the Cape Cod arena? Did Vince see this as a stepping stone? It was a stepping stone. It just makes perfect sense. He had the Evil Knievel. It didn't work. He had the Anoki versus Ali, which sounds like a wonderful idea. Knievel idea sounds fantastic. I remember watching it as a kid. I
Yeah.
loved it. I thought it was the greatest thing ever. And I remember watching freaking Anoki and Ali. It was great. Jerry's brother Jack was on the card because they were worried about Shea Stadium, about the ticket sales. Uh, it's a natural progression then. Okay, you're not going to make it big as a promoter. Go back and learn the building blocks a little bit. Did Vince see it that way? Or how did Vince see this? Was this Vince just trying to make a name for himself so he could go do something like this?
I mean, I think that Vince saw the Cape Cod years as the training wheels that he needed to go through and some experimentation. And Linda was really the key. I mean, Linda, from what I was told, Linda was there the whole time running operations, really understanding how how the business worked. And I think at the same time, I think that he knew that he was going to try to buy his dad out, and I think he had a multi-year plan for expansion. And the Coliseum kind of gave him some stability of running this building for a few years and again learning the ropes, but also starting to assemble the troops, right? He brings in so after the hockey thing goes, I don't think the hockey thing was ever like he was never wanting to be a hockey promoter. It was like just a thing
To
to
help.
give him reliable dates. But he got Jim Troy, who when the hockey thing went under, he said, "Hey, do you want a job as my senior vice president of Titan Sports?" Basically going out there and let's go and get the TV stations. Let's look into closed circuit. Let's think, big and ambitiously. And he needed someone like a Jim Troy to understand cable. I mean, Jim Troy had the connections that helped get him onto USA and helped get them into more of the cable world. And so I think it was like this sort of again this training period to really get ready for the big operation, right? And so I think he
What,
I
what,
would I think he would look at it as a success overall.
What was he also
what,
booking anything for his dad in the Northeast during the time?
My understanding is he was still booking Northeast shows.
Yeah.
He would go to the Garden shows, but his dad, and he would commentate for the syndicated shows every 3 weeks, and he would commentate for the Garden shows every month. But his dad was still booking the Garden and, running the programs and all that.
Does this
Yeah,
not
and
say
in your book, there's a great book, a six pack. You make a statement in there, which I agreed with 100%. There you go, John. Is that Linda is often looked at, not given the credit, and she's severely underrated in Vince's success in those early years. What do you mean by that? That she just kind of overlooked and not really noted? What?
Well, I think, it's funny because whenever we talk about this, we talk about it's singular Vince, right?
Uh,
But I
yeah.
think reality is like they should be looked at as a unit, as a couple, because
let me throw this in before you get rolling. My early days with WWF, when I finally got promoted up to the office where I was kind of an office guy, my dealings were mostly with Linda on the business side of it because I was doing the legislators with the commission. I was doing a lot of building work and all that stuff. all my reporting was really going to Linda, who would turn it over to Vince after we got going there. So you're right, she was such an important role there.
And by the way,
Well,
Jerry, when they did the IPO roadshow, I did a big part of it because I was the one talent that went with it because I could talk to stock
Right.
market stuff, and it was with Linda.
Yeah.
It was not with Vince. It was
Right.
with Linda. I love Linda McMahon. She's just a
Yeah. Yeah.
wonderful lady, but
Mhm.
she's not competent. She's very good. I mean,
Yeah.
she's really good at what she does.
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, in all the people I interviewed, whether they're wrestlers or office people or, employees, no one said a negative thing about, I mean, almost everyone said a negative thing about Vince. No one said a negative thing about Linda. I mean, then that's hard when you think about you're talking about everyone from the newspaper, the magazine guy to, the Iron Sheik, right? You got, this huge range of people and they all, I mean, when the Pennsylvania House of Representatives had someone testify about wrestling for regulation, they had Linda go, not Vince. When the New Jersey courts, it was Linda that testified, not Vince. I mean, there's a
There's a
reason
reason for that.
why Linda.
You do not want Vince on a stand. That
So,
man blows a gasket. He don't care who's there. It'll end up badly.
so I think Jerry, without Linda, is Vince successful? I mean, maybe to some extent, but probably not to the extent that he was. Because though, again, so one other thing I hope your listeners will check out. I have my website is thebradpack.com, and I have all this bonus material from the book.
It's
I was able
fantastic, by the way. I went through it since you sent it to us. It's absolutely fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah. So I have all the, I mean, I know a lot of your listeners are hardcore wrestling fans. So like, this is like stuff you're not going to find anywhere else because it's
Yeah.
internal documents, like financial documents, memos. I was able to get memos from 83, 84 from, the office that show that very early, here's Linda McMahon writing an office memo to Steve Taylor and Jim Barnett and Liz DeFabio and all these people saying, the granular level of control, saying like, we have been informed at our events that uh, people are having their cameras confiscated, by the Madison Square Garden security office. Can you please blah 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 blah. I mean, this is before email, right? These memos that go and tell you exactly, okay, you can't do this, you have to do that, don't do that. The only memo I have from Vince says basically don't come into my office without making an appointment. So, I think
He sends some of the greatest emails ever. Jerry will tell you.
Yeah.
They had a thing one time. They came out with here's what you missed this week on WWE Network.
Right.
Vince just wrote back, "I don't give a fuck what I missed."
Yeah.
that was the whole email. Like, all right, okay. I guess
Next.
which to Vince it was oversimple to Vince. Don't tell me what I missed. Tell me what I get. Tell me what I get by paying $9.99. Don't tell me what I'm missing. It was negative. And to Vince, he sees that right away. A lot of people don't, but that's the upbringing. And by the way, the link that you're talking about, we will put somewhere in the bottom of this. So if you're listening to this, all you got to do is go to the YouTube channel and you will be able to see all that link. It's what's amazing to me, Brad, is that you've got a guy who had a horse farm and a cement farm that failed. You had a huge prize fight that failed. You had one of the most spectacular closed circuit fails of all time with Evil Knievel, with this crazy Snake River jump. You had a guy go do a little bitty small arena in Cape Cod that no one's heard of. It's mainly just a summertime destination. I mean, how does this guy think I'm going to take over the world and buy the World Wrestling Federation for my father?
Mhm.
That's insane thinking. I mean, this is I failed, I failed, I failed, I failed. I've done something really small. I failed. I'm going to buy the biggest company in the world and I'm going to turn it into a global empire, which is exactly what he did. That's crazy thinking to me, right?
Yeah, but I think what Vince I think always knew and was right about was that the wrestling model was dead. The wrestling model that had been working in terms of, regional, like it was not going to last forever because of technology. And I think that these other things that he did were probably, um, experiments. But I think, what's in his, as much as he may hate it, Vince is a pro wrestling promoter. He's a pro wrestling kid, a pro wrestling
Boy,
adult.
if he heard that, he would be he would not.
Pro wrestling.
I cannot tell you the head would blow off his shoulders. He
I'm
hates the
sure.
word pro wrestling and he hates promoter.
Right. But I mean, but when he knew that his father's business was pro wrestling, right?
I
And
was,
he,
I think, I'm going to kick you off. I just want to tell you a story right quick. We ended with Vince one time, and I said, the guy just treated me like an old wrestler. And Vince said, you come from wrestling, you got to understand that. And I said, well, it's like you being treated like an old promoter. He looked at me and I thought he wanted to fight. And I said, see, I can't even say it to you using it as an analogy without you getting mad at me. That's how bad he is about promoter. I'm
yeah.
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, no, no. I mean, again, it's to some extent it's just semantics. I mean, Vince understands people very well, and he understands excitement and escapism and storyline, and you call it wrestling, you call it entertainment, whatever you want to call it. He knows how to tap into that, and I think he saw that the technology was changing in a way that it was not you were not going to be allowed to have the territory system forever. And so all these things with the closed circuit, it was all, an experiment, trying to understand the technology. But he knew that if he could be in control and he could leverage that technology to have a national audience, and he could let the sort of story of wrestling take precedence over the athletic competition part of it, that he would be onto something. And he was right, right? I mean, he allowed the histrionics, the storytelling to have a little more of an advantage over the realism of the athleticism. And that was and he when he saw Hulk Hogan in 1980, I think he saw that was it. Like that was the guy that he knew if I could take that guy and I could, put him at the front of the ship, this is the guy that can do everything I just said, right? He's got the telegenic look for TV. He's got the character. He just needed to get him back from, from Vern Gagne and from his dad. And I think, who knows in 1981 when Hulk left, if he told him, hey, Terry, like, just keep in touch because I'm going to be making some moves. I don't know if he said that, but 2 years later, he flew to Minneapolis and said, okay, now's the time. Right. So I think Vince, like you said, John, I don't think all those failures meant much because I think he knew deep down that the thing that he was going to be successful at was the wrestling business
Right.
Pro
because
wrestling.
that was in his blood. That's what he knew best.
Right.
Do you think, Brad, you mentioned in there that he had the opportunity to buy ESPN? How factual is that, and how close did that ever come, or did it?
Well, that's a story that, so we can get into Bob McMullen in a minute, but Bob McMullen was the CFO that Vince brings in '83. So we can go to '83 if you want me to jump into that, John and
No,
Jerry.
no.
We, we,
Well,
we can get to it or we can jump up and go back, whatever you want to do.
okay, so so he buys the company from his dad in '82, right?
Yeah.
And now he's brought in Ed Cohen, Jerry, you mentioned Ed Cohen, who's these guys are all, I think Ed Cohen might have gone to school with Timmy White. I
With
think
Timmy White, yeah,
he went
that's
to
true.
Roger Williams University, I believe, in Rhode Island. And Ed Cohen becomes the arena booker. So in the six pack in my book, I have this scene where I talk about, Ed Cohen having this giant map on the wall,
Yeah,
where his job is to like triangulate all the travel, all
I saw that map, so that's a true.
yeah. And that's a tough job, right? Is like, okay, how do we make this travel schedule work? But that's Vince brings him in to handle that. And he brings in Steve Taylor to be, so Vince realizes I need control. I need my own proprietary WWF everything. I need my own magazine. I need my own merchandise, my own figures, my own. I need to upgrade my TV production. I need my own TV studio. There's no more of this. I'm going to outsource my magazine to, Norman Kietzer's publication, or I'm going to outsource this to some other group. So he starts hiring all these people, massive hiring blitz. And that's when he moves Jerry to Greenwich, Connecticut in 83. The company, they leave Cape Cod, they go to Greenwich, they go to Holly Hill Lane and open the office there. Jim Barnett now has defected from the NWA, and he's now with Vince. And so Jim brings all the connections of the TV stations in the South and so forth. Um, and then, of course, later on he would bring in you, Jerry, and your brother, and so he's going to do that in a little bit. But first, he has to get his books in order,
Mhm.
and he hires this young financial guy named Bob McMullen, who basically realizes very quickly that that their financial systems are way out of date. Because what they're doing is like the agents are running around with hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, and
I bet I was a part of that.
as Bob told me that he would have to wait 3 weeks for the agents to literally come in with the bag of cash to deposit it. If you're trying to run an organization with payroll and you're growing, how do you possibly have enough cash flow on hand if you have to wait every 3 weeks to get a bag of cash? Right. So one of the first
You
things
know
Bob,
what? We know what I find a little strange about that, Brad. He had Barnett with him now. Before Vince, we had expanded into the Sheik's old territory, Michigan, Ohio. I set up all the towns. I would do all the settlement. I would have that money with me, unless it was a holiday or weekend. I couldn't get to the bank. But if it was a weekday, I was immediately had to have required to go to the bank. And this is through order from Barnett. Go to the bank, get a bank. Or one time the FBI came at me because I had $10,000, and that's right when the drug cartels would go on their money. So I cashed it. You couldn't cash in over $10,000 without a red flag on it. So I cashed in 10 grand, sent the check to Barnett. I immediately wired the check to Barnett. So I don't know how Vince got stayed in an antiquated situation with Barnett there, because we had to turn in the money right away.
no, well, so what I'm saying is Barnett gets there the same time, more or less, that
Okay,
Bob McMullen
that's
gets
separate.
there.
Okay,
And so what Bob McMullen said was that he adopted a system of, okay, getting the tax
from
ID.
Southern Pro Wrestling.
Right. So he starts giving the agents, okay, take your money, like Jerry's saying, get a bank check, get that check deposited, and get the cash flow. So, Bob told me that immediately they had 250 grand come in cash flow because they started getting the house show money deposited much quicker.
That's
Uh,
just crazy. They'd be carrying, $100,000
Yeah.
around back in
yeah.
1982. I mean, it's not safe. It's not good business
No,
practice. There's nothing good about that.
Well,
no.
and Bob also said they weren't even insured, so they had to,
Wow.
get through.
That's one of the things about the Cape Cod crew that was so important to Vince. I've seen Timmy White and Arnie Scollin sit there with cash, and those guys, I mean, from eyesight, can tell if they're being cheated. And that
Mhm.
was such an advantage dealing with these crooked promoters all over the country. Now, not all of them were, but a lot of them, when it's cash business, I mean, guys find ways to, have double ticket accounts. They find ways to hide cash here, dollar for you, dollar for me. I mean, Tim White has saved Vince millions of dollars probably, and Arnie Scullin by being able to count cash. They could look by sight and tell you if a guy was right or wrong. It was they were incredibly valuable to Vince
Yeah, yeah. So I
because
think,
everything was a cash settlement.
right. One thing I had never heard before that Bob told me was that around this time, around 84, the IRS actually sued Vince for back taxes. And I've never seen the paperwork on that, but
I've never heard that either myself.
he said that he ended up introducing some lawyers to Vince to defend him and that Vince was able to settle with the IRS. But one thing that came up in that was everyone always thought that Vince and Linda owned the Cape Cod Coliseum. And apparently, because of that, the IRS was coming after him for that. And then Vince was able to produce the paperwork that said, no, I just have a lease on the building. I don't own the building. And it ended up that actual owner of the Cape Cod Coliseum sold it in like 1984, and then it became like I think like a Christmas tree lot or something. So yeah, so Vince, he had his issues with the IRS. He had his issues financially. I think once he brings in Bob McMullen and then later Doug Sages to, kind of manage the money, he's on more solid footing financially. But, again, he's not really, when people talk about WrestleMania 1, it was still a big financial risk, even if it may not have been life and death for the company, but it wasn't like the company was, in huge, great financial shape because although the revenue was pouring in, the outflow, the costs were skyrocketing too.
Yeah, and one thing that Vince was putting together was not just a great talent roster; it was everything roster. I've said
Yeah,
many times, one of the keys to success was to WrestleMania was the Briscoe brothers. When Vince got the Briscoe brothers, he got the South, and he
right.
got the ability to get into arenas, which Crockett 83 Super Clash, that was one of the greatest cards of all time, or Starcade, whatever it was. It was the greatest cards of all time. There's 10 or 12 WWE Hall of Famers on
Mhm.
that card. But the problem was Crockett didn't have presence. He didn't have arenas for the closed circuit. He just had a great show. Vince had presence, and that infrastructure he built was a lot of the Cape Cod guys that came with him, but also hiring a lot of these guys, hiring
Yeah,
those Southern pro wrestling guys that could get him in every single arena and closed circuit place in the world. I mean, it was really incredible what Vince did. And plus, he was buying national TV contracts.
yeah,
Everything he was doing, he was putting together this entire uh, platform to go national. It's just incredible to me that here's a guy. Maybe it's like Abe Lincoln. You fail, you fail, you fail, you fail, you fail. You become the greatest president of all time. Vince failed, 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 becomes the greatest wrestling promoter of all time. It's an incredible story.
yeah. I mean, the timing was so right, right? I mean, it was the timing with cable and again, you can point to all having Linda, having the Briscoes, having the office staff, and then I mean, again, the age-old chicken or the egg story of wrestling is Hogan or Vince, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, Hogan is a major factor. I think you don't have they both needed each other equally, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think Hogan was the guy. There's no doubt about it. I don't know. They talk about Dusty being it, and Dusty would have been great. He'd been the guy too, but Hogan was the right guy at the right time, and that's
Right.
I
why
mean,
when people look at the greatest of all time, where is that Mount Rushmore? That's one of the reasons I think Hogan always belongs in that Mount Rushmore because without Hogan, we don't have what we have now. We might have got there, but Hogan got us there really quick.
Right. Yeah.
yeah, Jerry. I mean, remember you telling me that you really didn't like Vince. You didn't like Vince before, when you were competing with him,
Right.
and you really like you guys were just really upset and down on him. But then when you and your brother went up to WWF, um, it must have caused a strain on your relationships with a lot of your buddies, right? Because
Yeah.
you're going to the north.
That's exactly right. And my dislike wasn't a personal dislike. It was just like, I told you when Vince would come around with Vince Sr., he was a really standoffish guy, which was unusual, as I found out later from Vince.
Yeah.
He wasn't a friendly guy. He wasn't outgoing like Vince Sr. was at that time. I mean, Vince Sr., he was this iconic looking man, with a big suits on and the rings and watches and all that. Very friendly, outgoing, and yet you have a son over here who's basically the same age that you were kind of wanting to befriend, but he's kind of a standoffish guy and didn't want to. We didn't invite him out to have beers later. He just didn't want to be around pro wrestlers at that time. So that was my distasteful. But after a couple of meetings, Jack and I had vision when we were coming up, being two college boys, that we think this business can grow, and we think it can grow a different way. And having the mentorship of Eddie Graham and listen to what his thoughts were on cable TV, we knew what we had. and had that vision, formed the vision to make us want to sell. And we kind of handpicked who we wanted to sell through Vince. And after meeting with him, he had that same vision that Jack and I was having, and we figured, well, he's in the media capital of the world. He's going to be able to fulfill this vision a heck of a lot easier than Jim Crockett is in the South.
Yeah. And then, on the TV side, look, don't forget about, Kevin Dunn. Dennis Dunn
Yeah,
was Kevin's
yeah,
father that
right.
ran the TV, but Kevin Dunn and Nelson Sweglar and there's the another guy,
Joe Perkins.
Joe Perkins, yeah.
Yeah,
And then forgetting his name, there was another TV producer that was there for years that they all came together and really upgraded the look of the
right.
TV product, right? And they even
Exactly.
built that studio that in Stanford to have their own
Right.
facility that they could work out of. So
Exactly.
Yeah,
um,
100%. 120 North Hamilton. Jerry's been there many
Yeah.
times. It's right across
Yeah.
the road, right across 95 from Titan Towers, about a half a mile. But yeah,
yes,
Kevin Dunn, his father, for those that don't know, his father worked with Vince Sr., and his father was going blind. And Kevin never planned on getting into the business and got into the business because his father was going blind. And Kevin become maybe, I think, the greatest executive producer, maybe in the history. I'm not exaggerating, in the history of television. I
You're
mhm,
mean,
not exaggerating either.
in the history of television. The stuff he did was so freaking groundbreaking. When we were in that war with WCW, we knew the one thing advantage we had was Kevin Dunn and Vince, but that team together, there was nothing like it. I mean, here's two, second and third generation guys that grew up in this business, and together they're the ones that changed the world. But so much is done, not said about Kevin Dunn. He was freaking genius, absolute freaking genius.
yeah, yeah. I mean, at the end of the, I mean, what any company's success comes down to, and it's real simple, right? Is how how much is coming in, and how much is going out, money
Right.
wise, right?
Bottom
And I
line.
think you can, when you really dig into the details of a budget and the line items, this is where Linda was so important, was that all those little things add up. So for the little details from the way that they did the merchandising and how they capitalized on the brand of their performers, right? Having the dolls and the figures and the posters, all the way down to the fact that when they started doing pay-per-view a few years later, remember that when you had a pay-per-view, it was from the talent's perspective, it's just like a big house show, right? You get a better payoff. But guess what? Vince didn't give any of the money from the pay-per-view revenue to the talent. So think about how much money he was banking in those early years on
Wow. Yeah.
Survivor Series and wrestling. So if you gross 3 million in pay-per-view dollars, but the gate is 100,000 or 200,000. Well, you break up the 200,000 among the talent,
So the
but
talent wasn't getting the pay-per-view at the beginning?
no.
No, no.
Oh, I didn't know that because by the time we got there, there was always supposed to be some, mathematical equation, which
Yeah. So
mathematical equation was Vince's head, and he was the best payoff guy in the business by far. So nobody bitched about it, but that mathematical equation, it looked good on paper, but that was about as all it was worth.
So, so when Bill Eadie sued Vince, that was one of his main points was like, hey, you know, I performed on all these shows and you didn't give any of the revenue from those shows to the talent. So my point is, you can argue the ethics of all that, but the point is from just a business perspective, all those little things that Vince was thinking of and Linda was thinking of, they all add up. And I think he did that from a revenue diversification perspective. He did that better than the other promoters did, and that's why he was more successful.
You know what?
Brad, I believe that same formula is carried out today because these guys are on guaranteed contracts. So it makes no difference if they do 10 million buys or a million buys, they're still getting the same money as they would
Well,
with the
I mean,
other guys.
the guaranteed contracts changed everything, right? Because again, but that was another thing that, when he started, so in 84, he starts trying to basically making all the guys sign these boilerplate contracts. And the contract, this is just the very basic, the original contract was like 2 pages long. You probably drafted it, I mean, there was no HR department, none of that. And it said, you are guaranteed nothing for your merchandise.
It's the most one-sided contract in the
Yeah.
history of the contracts in the world. I
So
signed
Yeah.
one of them. I know
yeah,
exactly
well,
what you're
it's
talking about.
brilliant because then when Vince gives you 2% royalties, he's look how generous I'm being. I don't have to give you anything, but I'm giving you
Yeah.
2%.
You were guaranteed 10 shows a year at $150 a show.
Yeah. 150. Yeah.
Yeah, I signed it. It was one-sided I never read one of those contracts WWE sent me. I just,
So
I knew the handshake behind it was good, so I never cared.
if again, if we're trying to analyze why even John, after all those failures, why he was successful, I think when it came time to make his big move, which was wrestling, he was able to understand that, how to generate enough revenue and those big risks paid off like WrestleMania, right? That that the money was there and once the money starts coming, then you can take bigger risks and then it just blows up.
Yeah, and one thing you said about Vince, about the storyline being bigger than the athleticism of what's going on. I'll give you a good story. When I first started doing commentary, I said something about the guy hits him with the drop kick or whatever it was, and Vince was John, and you could tell it's a teaching moment. You can just tell by Vince saying that, because Vince was very patient with me at times. People are going to find that surprising because Vince wasn't always patient, but he's very patient with me. And he said, John, I know it's a drop kick. It's not radio. Tell me why I should care about the person throwing the drop kick or the person getting hit by the drop kick and why it matters. And that was Vince's idea for everything. That was his idea for commentary, So it was so much more important of why am I hitting you with this drop kick? Who are you? Who am I? And who is that? What is that story involved? And I think that you're right. That's a lot of the success that goes into so many people saying, oh, just put good wrestling out there. It's not an either or. You want good wrestling, but you got to have those stories that go around it. And that's what Vince, in my opinion, was so good about.
Mhm,
To
mhm.
your point. So the Cape Cod years, and also, by the way, the friendly tap, was it 20,000 or 100,000?
Oh, well,
It says in your book 20, I think. And for some reason, I had 100 in my head. Maybe I just made that
it
up.
says I'm trying to remember. I mean, I think Mike Breen was asking for a loan of 20 grand, right?
Well,
And
they came in. He said we're going to quit, and or
yeah,
something to that effect.
Yeah.
And Vince goes, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, we're going to start up a bar. We just need a lot of money." And whatever it was $20,000. And Vince,
What's a lot of money? What Vince's
well, what's a lot of money? They said $20,000. Vince goes, $1 million is a lot of money.
yeah,
And
yeah, that's yeah, yeah, yeah. That,
and
yeah,
so
that I mean, and that story, I mean, it does, does show you that Vince could be extremely generous, and he never, I don't think he ever asked for the money back, or he wanted to take care of. One of the things that Mike Breen told me was that yeah, Vince was very because he would in those Cape Cod years, Vince and Linda, the kids were very young. Mike Breen was single. Everyone was pretty young. They would go out and they'd party, and he said that Vince was always trying to set him up with their housekeeper or something. Like Vince was always wanting like people to get together, very family oriented, very like wanting to help and take care of. So I think Vince, he had that kind of um, he wanted to see people happy and wanted to help them where he could. So like everyone, he's a complicated guy. I know that people like Mike Breen and Jim Troy were very grateful that he helped them in those circumstances.
yeah, there's a guy who was you talk about Capital City Wrestling. There was an old guy who used to come here all the time, and Jerry might know who he is. I can't remember who he was. He was 70 something years old, and he showed up. They'd always give him a little bit of money. And I asked Timmy White one day, I said, "Who is that?" And he said, back in the day, he said that man took care of Vince McMahon Sr. And he asked his son always take care of him. So Vince would always have him show up with his bag. The man was 70 something years old, but to
Mhm.
not embarrass him, he would show up with his bag. Vince goes, I'm sorry. He'd do the same song and dance. I'm sorry. Don't have anything for you today. But since you came down, I'll pay you. And Vince would always, take care of him. And he was late one day and he goes, Why are you late? He goes, well, my car broke down. He told Timmy White, he goes, Go buy him a car. And so they went and
Yeah.
bought the man Jerry knows, brand new Lincoln.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Vince
There
did
was
that
a
all
guy. There
over.
was a guy that went in the Hall of Fame. I can't recall his name
I
either, but
can't think of his name. Nice old man. Just
yeah.
super nice old man would show up and sit in Vince's office. Vince would talk to him. And I asked Vince about it one time. I said, Vince, who is that old man? He said, John, you ever hear that song, Bad, Bad Leroy Brown? I said, yes, sir. He goes, it should have been written about that man. He took care of Vince Senior, and because of that, Vince Junior took care of him the rest of his life. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah.
So, Brad, the takeaway from the entire Cape Cod era, what do you think the takeaway is? Was this the building blocks of everything that Vince McMahon did? I mean, he got his feet in the business. It seemed like the perfect progression. He got his feet in the business. He tried some big pay-per-views. They didn't closed circuits. They didn't work. Then he goes back to learning, and he learns this business from the ground up, and comes back and buys a company for $1 million, which seemed way too low, by the way, and then sells it for $9.3 billion about 30 years later and retained control somehow.
Yeah.
Was this the most formative years of his life?
Yeah, I think again, like to end where we started, I think I would love, we've only just scratched the surface here, right? This is I mean this was one part of one chapter of my book. I wish there was a whole book that was written about the Cape Cod days and the 70s, because again, the 70s, he's in his 30s. He's learning a lot, he's growing, and I think there's still a lot out there about this, but I think that the Cape Cod years, 79 to 83, is it's kind of the prequel to everything, right? This is the getting the troops together, this is hiring people, this is also when he literally, buys the company from his dad. This is getting Hulk Hogan back. It's putting all the pieces in place. And I think it maybe it's not surprising that he was in one place, operating one building, because it's sort of this period of stability, right, where he's just putting all the pieces on the board for to make his big move. And so, um, yeah, I think it's an underrated part of the Vince story. I mean, in that entire documentary, I don't think they even mentioned Cape Cod, right? So
Right.
again, if you really want to understand Vince, I think that part of his life is the part that still needs the most exploration and appreciation.
Who knows, Brad? We might have inspired you to a new book here, The
Yeah.
Cape Cod Days with Vince
Right.
McMahon. But one thing before we leave here, and I know we kept you a long time, I want to
That's
get into
okay.
we mentioned Steve Taylor's name, how vital he was, and how he put Vince was always known for putting together the right people in the right positions all the time. And Steve Taylor with personality, but Steve is the one that was doing the photography, as everybody, most people know about our company. And but he was sent out on these missions where he would pass business cards out. Tell us how the trip to Minnesota, how that, because I think that's a fascinating part of Vince McMahon's mindset and how he operated.
Yeah, and so actually, I've been in touch with Steve Taylor, and he didn't want to talk to me for the book, but it was because he said, one day I want to tell my whole story, and I hope he does, because Steve Taylor, like you said, Jerry, is one of the guys that was there from the beginning, who's still alive, and was a lot more than a photographer. And so he's got all kinds of insight into all of this that he's, has not shared so far. But he did share enough with me to, help tell the story of how ultimately how Vince got Hulk Hogan back, which, late 83, Hulk is in the AWA and really hot, selling out, with Nick Bockwinkel and really Vern Gagne. If it wasn't for his ego, I think Hulk would have been if it wasn't for Vern's ego,
Okay.
Hulk would have been the
I'm glad you
AWA.
specified which ego, because
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
dealing
yeah.
with egos here.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Hulk should have been the AWA champion.
Yeah.
But, because of Vern's issues, he never did it. And so around that time, uh, Vince calls a meeting and says to Steve Taylor, "Hey, Steve, Hogan's going to be at the Rosemont Horizon. I want you to give him this business card that has on the back of it his Vince's number, and I want you to find a way to get it to him." And this is how brilliant, the whole Vince operation was that at the same time he had just started a new magazine called Victory Magazine and brought in a guy named Ed Helinsky to be the editor and Steve Taylor to be the photographer. And he starts his own magazine, and then Ed and Steve start calling the other promoters like Vern saying, "Hey, we'd love to feature your promotion in our new magazine. Can we send a photographer out to shoot your guys?" And they're like, "Yeah, sure." So Steve Taylor goes out to the Rosemont Horizon show to photograph, the show for the magazine, but really the whole point is so he can get in front of Hulk Hogan. And backstage, he guess he whispers to Hulk like, I've got something for you. And Hulk says, well, give it to me when you shake my hand. And because I mean, according to Steve, the agent, I think it was like one of the blackjacks was like
It's
watching,
probably Mulligan. It's probably Mulligan at that time.
watching him like a hawk, right? Because like this is now Steve, Steve's from WWF, and what is this guy doing here? But I guess he palms the business card to Hogan when he shakes his hand, and it just says, call me. And that's when Hogan calls Vince, and they set up the
Wow.
secret meeting where Vince flies out to Minnesota. Apparently, they stay up all night. Vince lays out the plan for putting the belt on Hogan, and then Hogan, when he's in Japan, I think in December or November, sends a telegram to Vern Gagne that says, I quit," and Vern thinks it's a rib, and so it takes a while to convince Vern that no, Hogan's not coming back. And when he gets back from Japan, that's he goes to New York, and then the whole thing happens where now, Backlund doesn't really want to drop the belt. And then for a minute, Vince Sr. gets cold feet because Vince Sr. is still alive and he's still booking the
Right.
Garden. And he says to Vince Jr., "I don't know, you sure we want to do this?" And basically, Vince Jr. says, "Dad, we got to go through with this." And they do the transition. Sheik wins the belt. A month later, Hogan wins the belt, and there you go.
Wow. There you
Wow,
go.
that is tremendous. What a story. Was
Yeah.
a was well, before we go, one more question. Was $1 million way too low?
Yes.
Yeah.
Did
Yes.
his dad do that because that was his son? I mean, is that what
I
Colin and Gorilla were upset about?
I think so. I think
Yeah.
that it was way undervalued, and I think that I mean, Jerry, so Jerry, no one knew when Vince bought the company in '82. Like, no one knew that for a while, right?
Right. Right. Nobody knew for a long time, about 4 months, I guess.
And so in '83, I think at the NWA convention in '83, I think Vince Senior, like pulled out of the NWA.
Right.
And that's when things started to, really get kind of crazy. And so I think that, that's when everyone knew that something was up, right? And so, but then Vince Senior apparently still, didn't love this idea of expansion and taking over. And there's this, I forget exactly the context, but there's this great quote where, Vince Senior is having cold feet and Vince Jr., makes his case, and his dad's like, "Oh, fuck him." You know, we're gonna go do this, right?
Yeah, well,
So
I tell you this, Vince Senior, when he got wind of the deal, called Eddie Graham. Eddie Graham knew about it, and Eddie Graham kept his mouth shut too. But Vince Senior called Eddie because they were so tight, and Eddie called Jack and asked Jack, "What are you trying to do? Kill our business? Kill the pro wrestling business?" And Jack said, "No, we're trying to enhance the business." Was Jack's exact words back to
Mhm.
Eddie. And Eddie, unfortunately, Eddie never spoke to Jack or I again after that.
Oh
Really?
wow.
Yeah, yeah,
He was upset at you guys for selling out,
yeah, exactly.
even though you guys offered plenty of opportunities for other guys to buy
Right.
you
Yeah.
guys out, and no one took you up on it.
No one took us up on it, but Eddie would not speak to us again, and after that, so
Wow. And Vince Senior's the one that let Eddie know that you guys were selling.
yeah, Vince Senior told Eddie that we'd made the sell. We had called Gordon solely after we signed the contracts and everything was said and done. We called Gordon, offered Gordon a position. Vince got on the phone, offered Gordon. He said, "No, I'm staying loyal to the people who brought me to the dance, Eddie Graham." And But Gordon and Jack got on the phone and told Gordon, please don't tell anybody this until it breaks. And Gordon stayed true to his word, just like he did to the NWA. Gordon was that type of man. He was a good, honest man.
Wow. Such incredible times. I mean, there's just not, that's why I love pro wrestling. It's because there's nothing like this. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not like the Dallas Cowboys had a territory here and New York Giants had a territory up there and they're competing with each other. You know, you don't see this in other sports or entertainment. You see it only in wrestling. It's just wild.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it makes you think like I don't know if the stories about today's industry will be anywhere near as interesting, right? Because you had so many players back then. You had this regional, dynamic, and now everything is,
And
national
Jerry,
and big and
I'm sorry, and Jerry and Jack, got a hit put out on him. Ole put a bounty on him. They claimed that there was a mafia hit put out on him too by Ole. I mean that you're not going to see stuff like that again. It's crazy.
And also we were asked not to attend Eddie Graham's funeral, which was a couple of years later.
Really? That's horrible.
Yeah.
As loyal as you guys were to him.
Yeah.
And the fact that you guys offered to sell it to anybody else and nobody was there.
Yeah.
Wow.
But that was pro wrestling business back there. That
Pro
was
wrestling.
sports entertainment.
Hey, Brad, that's the book, Six Pack. It is absolutely fantastic. Brad, thanks for coming. I've been looking forward to this show since we talked last time. I think this is just absolutely fascinating. The learning of Vince McMahon, what he had to go through to get, people just think it was all win. He's a son of a promoter who's a son of a promoter. And, he had bankruptcy after he had bankruptcy, he had failures. He had so much going wrong with him. He's 40 when he first makes it big, not 20.
Right.
That's a big difference. It's such a cool story, and you've done such a good job of articulating a six pack and also articulating it on the show today. So thank you very much for coming on.
Hey, no, it's great, guy. It's so much fun to do this because Jerry was there. I mean, Jerry,
Right.
the living history in terms of that era, and then John, you have more of the '90s and later perspective. So you kind of see Vince in all these different stages, right?
Right. And it's so interesting that Vince McMahon of 1990 or 95 or 2005 would have produced that hockey team completely different.
Oh yeah. Well, that's an interesting, like, imagine that scenario where like all of a sudden the hockey thing goes and Vince becomes the biggest hockey promoter.
That's right. That's right. Well, Brad, thank you.
All right,
Thank you.
guys. Appreciate it.